Today, millions of people celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Cities dye rivers green, restaurants serve Irish food, people wear shamrocks and talk about leprechauns. But the real Patrick was once a kidnapped slave. And the story of how he went from terrified teenager to one of the most influential missionaries in European history is far stranger, far more interesting than the holiday that grew up around him. Hi, I'm Papa G. After many years in the history classroom, I still enjoy discovering the deeper story behind familiar traditions. So we're doing a deep dive with Papa G. Patrick himself left us a small autobiography called the Confessio, written near the end of his life. And when historians read it, we read that the real story of Patrick begins not in Ireland, but in Roman Britain. Patrick was born around the year 390 AD into a relatively comfortable Christian family. His father was a deacon, his grandfather had been a priest. But Patrick later admitted that as a teenager, he wasn't particularly interested in faith. Then, when he was about 16 years old, everything changed. Irish raiders attacked the British coast. They captured Patrick and carried him across the Irish Sea, where he was sold as a slave. For the next 6 years, Patrick worked as a shepherd in the cold hills of Northern Ireland, probably near Slemish Mountain. Imagine the situation. Teenage boy, far from home, watching sheep on lonely hillsides through rain and wind and winter cold. In his own words, it was during that time that something inside him began to change. Patrick wrote that he started praying constantly, sometimes 100 prayers during the day and nearly as many as at night. Isolation has a way of forcing reflection, and the frightened teenager who had arrived in Ireland slowly came to believe that God had not abandoned him. Then one night, Patrick said he experienced a dream. In the dream, a voice told him, "Your ship is ready." Patrick believed it meant escape. So he did something extraordinary. He ran. Patrick walked nearly 200 miles across Ireland, traveling through unfamiliar territory until he finally reached the coast. Then he found a ship preparing to sail. According to his own account, the sailors were not particularly impressed with a runaway slave asking for passage. But eventually, they agreed to take him aboard. Patrick thought his ordeal was over. It wasn't. After about 3 days at sea, the ship finally reached land. From there, the travelers set out on foot through a sparsely populated wilderness. And for nearly 4 weeks, they struggled to survive. Food ran out. So Patrick prayed, as the sailors mocked Patrick's faith. And in one of the most dramatic moments of the story, he later wrote that a herd of wild pigs suddenly appeared, providing food just when they believed starvation was near. Eventually, Patrick made his way to Britain and was reunited with his family. You might think that it would be the end of the story. Most people would never want to see the place of their captivity again. But years later, Patrick said he had another dream. This time, he heard what he called the voice of the Irish. In the dream, they called out to him, "We ask you, holy boy, to come and walk among us once more." Patrick interpreted this as a calling. So after years of study and preparation, he returned to Ireland, not as a slave, but as a missionary. This was no easy task. Ireland at the time was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms ruled by local chieftains and influenced by powerful druids, the religious leaders of Celtic society. Patrick had to travel constantly. He negotiated with local kings, baptized converts, helped establish small Christian communities. According to later traditions, he even challenged royal authority directly, lighting the Paschal fire in the Hill of Slain in defiance of a pagan festival commanded by the High King. Whether every detail of that story is accurate or not, Patrick's own writings make one thing very clear. He spent decades traveling across Ireland, preaching, baptizing, and organizing Christian communities. And over time, the religious landscape of Ireland changed. Patrick was not the only missionary in Ireland, but he became the most famous. Partly because he left behind his own words, partly because his life contained something people remembered. He had once been a slave on that island, so when he returned as a missionary, he did so with a credibility that few outsiders could claim. Over the centuries, the legends grew. Stories appeared about Patrick driving snakes out of Ireland, which probably symbolizes the decline of pagan traditions. The shamrock became associated with his teaching about the Trinity, and eventually, March 17th became a day of celebration, not just in Ireland, but around the world. But behind all those traditions stands a much simpler story. A frightened teenager, kidnapped and enslaved. Years of isolation transformed him, and instead of returning with anger or revenge, he returned with a mission. History often celebrates emperors and conquerors. Patrick reminds us that sometimes the people who change a culture most deeply are not soldiers or kings, but former slaves who chose to come back. And that makes the real story of St. Patrick far more remarkable than green rivers or lucky charms ever could.